Hamitakepi Kate Makiapie Dakotia Ahedipuindemiaye Wapai Pakshan Edomawapi Ka Ampetukte, our home native Minnesota gallery Dedyat Dayanya Hippie. Hello, my relatives. My name is Kate Bean. In Dakota, I'm known as Brings Them Home Woman, and I am a citizen of the Flandreau Santee Sioux Dakota. Today, I welcome you to the Our Home Native Minnesota Gallery at the Minnesota History Center. I serve as Director of Native American Initiatives here at MNHS, and before we begin, I want to acknowledge that even though this is a virtual event, the Minnesota History Center is located on the traditional territory of Dakota people within the larger region that we have always called home. Minnesota is centered within Dakota creation stories and is also an important place in traditional Ojibwe history and migration. And Minnesota is a significant location in the histories of other Native nations as well. We pay our respects to our Indigenous ancestors of this place. I should also mention that our guest today is streaming live from our Tituan or Lakota relatives' homelands in South Dakota. We are glad that you can join us here today, and as we welcome you to join us each month for this Artist in the Gallery series as we listen to and learn from Native artists, teachers, and makers. Please leave questions in the chat throughout the hour. Staff are moderating that space, and we will bring up these questions later in our conversation during the Q&A. With that, I'd like to introduce you all and welcome you to our home gallery, Randilynn.
Hamidakiapi, Ampetukende Chantewashteanape, Chuzapedo, Dakota Chaje, Zinkdana Dutowi, Imachiapi, Washichuia, Randilynn Boucher-Giago, Imachiapi. I'm happy to be here with you. My name is Randilynn Boucher. My Dakota name is Redbird Woman, and I'm looking forward to our talk tonight.
Namaste. So what kind of artwork do you create, Randilynn?
I think a lot of the art I have focused on actually started small and it built its way up. I remember first starting with moccasins and also learning how to make leggings. But a lot of my art started with my children. When they were born, I started with their moccasins and their bonnets, and that led into the bigger pieces of cradle boards and like their belongings of the turtle, the lizard amulet. And you know, I think that's where it really started. You see the picture here, it's my oldest daughter, Monica Gallego, and she went right into a cradle board from birth. So it was kind of like creating art that was associated with them as they grew. So I guess it really starts around a lot of children's belongings, children's items, and just following them as they've grown.
We have another one of your beautiful cradle boards here in our home gallery. How would you describe your work to somebody who has never encountered it or is not familiar with beadwork?
I think with what I have started to create, I think over time it's grown in the design and the style. How I would explain it to them would be just my own journey of discovering my own style and what I feel is important, what I feel is important to for them to understand, like with design, with techniques, with styles. And for me, my art stems from my own learning and my own research and my own understanding. So if somebody was to see this cradle board in the museum here and they were to see the top design, it tells a story. And I would like for them to understand it. I would show them and have them, for one, ask them, what do you see? Because when we look at art, a lot of us see things differently. And that's the beauty of art. We have our own interpretations. But in creating it, it's like it's telling a story in the way I see it. This particular cradle board here, I would explain it that when I created it, creating this balance between what is above is below. Because our children, when they come to us, they come from the stars, and they come through this path to us. And so the top of the cradle represents that. Um, and just explaining that, that cherished love that you have for your children. So when you lay them in this belonging, that you're ensuring that they're going to be who they're meant to be.
So there's so much love that's put into these cradle boards. And I think it's really reflective of a mother's love for her child, right?
Yes.
Do you consider what you do to be art?
The way I look at it is like, I don't really consider it art because what I create is living. What I create is a teaching. There's reason behind it. I see it as creating so that my children are grounded in who they are. So like the cradle board, I want them to be, embraced always, to have a straight back, to grow up with a clear mind. And so like to me, that's not really art. It's more like a grounding of who they're going to be. Same with their moccasins. It's the way I've always looked at it is as their ina, as their mother, it's my responsibility to enact my kinship to them. As a Dakota woman, it's my responsibility to be that relative that they chose me to be. And so by creating those, that's my love. That's my compassion for them. So to me, I don't see it as art because everything I create goes to a relative, goes to a loved one, so that they'll use it in their life. And it's not going to sit there, but it's going to be, used in the way that it's needed to be.
So what can you tell me about the history of these kinds of arts within Dakota women's lives?
The way my understanding and how I see it is, as Dakota women, that's just who we were. We lived and we made these things out of love. We were industrious, we were strong, we were exquisite artists already. And it wasn't so much just one person did it. It was about showing that love. So like when we talk about being Dakota, to me, being Dakota is about creating what my loved ones need. Being a Dakota mother, being a Dakota woman, it's about ensuring that what our grandmothers had continues, so that we continue to show that teaching, to show that way of being through what we create. And that's really how I feel it should be. When we look at things as just art or just being in a certain way, we lose the true meaning of it.
How has the work that you create been impacted by your own motherhood?
I think everything I created started with my motherhood, with my children. I was very fortunate to have my grandmothers, my mother, my mother-in-laws, my grandmother-in-laws, who, when I first had my daughter and I was getting ready for her, I was, fortunate enough for them to say, these are the things you need to prepare. These are the things that your child's going to need. And so I was really lucky to be guided. And so with my first daughter, it was really a learning because I didn't know. I wasn't a mother. And so through their teachings and their help, they guided me and showed me how to prepare. And then, each child, I felt like it got stronger and stronger. The items that I created, the cradle boards, the bonnets, the moccasins, the chekpa amulet for them. I mean, it's like, I feel like my children were my teachers in that sense, that if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have known how to create these things that are tied to Dakota motherhood. I wouldn't know how to be a mother if my female relatives didn't help me or prepare me or push me in that direction.
So your grandmothers were helping you prepare for your children and for their grandchildren, right?
Yes.
When you think about, there's terms for some of these things, such as the idea of intergenerational transference of knowledge. What does that mean to you?
What that means to me is that, like, what my mother, what they've taught me is now time for me to teach my girls. And I think that's shown as, especially with my own children, where each of them I prepared for. And so as their own siblings come along, my children are now learning how to prepare. And so it goes to the next generation. So it's not just so much I'm making these things for you, but we make these things for our relatives. One example would be right now, we have a new Takoja who's coming. And so we're going to prepare for them to come. And so my girls, that's their niece. And so they're excited to help prepare and start to make sure that this Trojan has everything, or Troshka has everything that they need when they get here. And so it's like even though they're not mothers, they're aunties. That's their Trojan now. So they're going to start preparing. I keep saying Trojan. Maybe I feel like she's going to be a girl. Maybe because we have a family of girls. But they will help prepare. So it's like through me creating, it's also teaching my children how to be the relative to our next little ones who are coming.
So you're actively revitalizing this art form for your own family, right?
Yes.
I think that when we think about how we see these works and this knowledge being transferred down in our families, when you think about our home, this gallery that I'm standing in, that we have your Cradle Board in, we really wanted to focus on the resiliency of home and that connection, right? And the ways in which those histories and those ways were passed down. Another piece we have here in our home gallery are the moccasins made by my grandmother. And I just want to show you really quick. I think you might have seen these before. So my grandmother Lillian Bean, my grandmother Lillian Bean, her grandmother Mary Eastman Faribault made these moccasins in 1911 for my grandmother. My grandmother passed them on to my daughter, who is 7, so she's not quite trusted with them yet, but they're in the gallery here. But I think that what you were just talking about and what your work really, really shows is the ways in which throughout history, throughout time, our ways are passed down, right? Mary Eastman was one of the children that was removed from Minnesota during the Dakota War, and yet she made those for my grandmother. And the ways in which you're continuing to make these cradle boards for your own children, I think is just so amazing and so beautiful. And so I thank you for that and for continuing that on. In 2018, you served as a Native American artist in residence here at the History Center. What can you tell us about your residency?
When I went through my residency, I think it was really an eye-opener for me. And partly because it was like, as you make these things, like I was within my home and I was figuring it out. But with the residency, it opened up different avenues for me. It expanded and pushed my research further. It allowed me to go into different museum collections, go back to Minnesota and be in the MHS collections. And, that was important because the way I seen it was these belongings are our relatives. These art forms are our relatives, and we have a connection to them. And so for me, it was really important because I don't know the last time this relative that's in any of these collections has been seen. And so through the residency, as I would go into these collections, I was able to truly look at this item and understand not only the techniques, the materials, the methods that went into it, but to see how delicate the work was. And what that also showed me was that compassion that our relatives had for one another. And so like through the residency, it was like, I feel like through all the research that I did, through all of, the belongings that I was very fortunate to see, it started to show me more of who we were as Dakota people. And I think that was one of the most important things. And then bringing that back to the community, having the community understand that we have our belongings still, and they're in collections, and they're being taken care of, but we have a choice to go and I was fortunate enough to have some of our relatives from the collections go back into the community in Sisseton. And for me, that was like, when was the last time they went home? Or, and so, having them seen, having them around family, around people was important. And I think that's one of the most important things that I felt was tying it back to community during the residency and bringing those teachings, that knowledge, that research back into the community. So it didn't just stay with me, but it was, once again, transferring that knowledge to the community.
I think that's so beautiful to think about, these relatives and collections returning home and being able to bring them home to our communities, and like my grandmother's moccasins coming home here to Minnesota, even though they were created in Sisseton, and the ways in which these objects, these materials, explaining the ways in which they really are our living relatives, and they pass down history, they pass down information and stories about us, right? So how did your residency impact your learning?
I think my residency really helped me to go into the community, but it also helped me to learn more. Like when I think of my art, when I first started compared to where I'm at now, during the residency, like research and being in collections really like showed me like this path of who we were, in the sense of design, in the sense of technique. And I see that, and I guess my example on how I see that would be through the changes in how I created the cradle boards that I've created. I feel like that through the residency, the knowledge that I gained, it helped me to expand what I create. It helped me develop a technique by looking at my relatives' belongings, to create what I felt my children needed or my relatives needed. And I really feel like it helped me see, like, it helped me see how important it is to give back, to others, not just to take the residency and, the knowledge I gained, but to be able to give it back and to teach others and to go back into the community and teach about these things. I think that was one of my biggest things that I really loved about the residency is doing workshops in the communities, being able to share pictures, being able to show them, what was in collections, what community it came from, how old it was. Look at this method, look at this technique. And like for me, I love teaching, but I also love sharing that information that not everybody in our community has. So I feel like the residency really pushed me more in that direction of being actively in the community teaching.
It's so interesting that that's such a Dakota, such a native perspective of the work you're doing, bringing it back to your community, which is so different than the history of museums and collecting, which was about taking out and removing, right? And here, where we're trying to make these reconnections. So when you talk about your residency and how you engage with community, what are some more specific examples of some of that engagement? I do have a Dakota curriculum here from Sisseton Wahpeton Tribal College that our dear relative, Erin Griffin, helped pass on to us, that you helped with creating. So what can you tell us about that experience?
I think that was one of the most important things about it, was creating those community connections. And I was really fortunate to work with individuals who wanted workshops that dealt with traditional Dakota art forms. One example was a Dakota Cradle workshop that took place in Sisseton at the Tribal College. Through the workshops, we focused on cradle board making. We worked with 25 Dakota women who were unchis, who were mothers, who were aunties, who were nieces, and sharing with them how to make a cradle board. And and I'm very grateful for that, because if it wasn't for Mashke Erin opening up this avenue, then there would be 25 less cradles in the community. And for me, that's important. It's important for, other people to learn. There was another cradle workshop that took place in Flandreau, and I was grateful to the relatives there who wanted to learn and who created these spaces. I think the most important part was creating the space for this to happen. And, and so when we were in Sisseton, we were also fortunate enough to bring some of the relatives from the collections back into the community there and to show the community, here they are. They're not lost. They're being taken care of, but this is what they look like. And so that's one example. The Dakota design curriculum came out of that as well. During the residency, with all the research, all of the documentation and everything that I was gathering, we decided to put it into a curriculum. How can we design this? How can we put this back into the community? And then out of that came a Dakota design class that I'm currently teaching in the Sisseton-Wahpeton College. And so it's really a way of bringing it back and making things available to the community, to the people. I think that was the best thing out of it, because it's not it's there. It's there, and it's been made for them. But one of the most important things too is when you sit down with people and you start to see the community that is built between, people who may have not have known each other at the workshops. And then you start to see not only are they learning how to create cradle boards, not are they only learning how to do bonnets or moccasins, they're building community amongst each other, and they're sharing that between them. And so it was almost like you could imagine how our Dakota mothers and granddaughters and unchis, how they all came together a long time ago when they created. And it was that's what we were also creating through these workshops.
So thinking about the history in our own communities of the sewing circles and when our women used to come together regularly, that sense of community, right? And learning from one another and just being with one another, which I think we all miss right now during the pandemic, right? I just, it's such a beautiful thing to share. And like you said, creating the space for that and supporting that, I think, is really important. So how do collections help inspire your artwork in other ways?
I think one of the things that I noticed when I went into collections was for my own, what I've created was the techniques. For an example, I was fortunate to go into, collections out east in Minnesota, multiple museums in Minnesota, and each of these collections had an item that was really intriguing. When I went over to the museum out east, NMAI, there was a cradle board there that was from 1830s. For me, making cradles for my daughters and how I've perceived and how I've developed them to be, and then going there and starting to see cradles from early 1800s, they were completely different. And so that really inspired me, because it was we were exquisite quill workers. We were exquisite artists even at that point. And I also feel that through being in collections, I started to see the skill and the level that our relatives had. And for myself, in learning, that pushed me to continue to learn these different methods, to learn these different techniques, and to see how our use, even if we didn't have something, how creative we were, and we worked with what we had. And so I think that's really important, after being in collections, because you see things and you're like, wow, I would have never thought of that. And yet they used it and they made it work.
Do you remember this piece from the Minnesota Historical Society?
Yes, that one was beautiful. I do remember that.
I think that, just being able to showcase the variety of styles and the variety of cradle boards out there it's they're also different, and each community has their own, right?
Yes. I think that's the biggest thing that you start to realize. It starts to shape and show you an identity of people. Oftentimes we have an idea of who people are, and then once you're, in collections and you're surrounded by, they say, open up this, shelf of Dakota items, and you're looking at them and you start to realize we weren't Plains Indians. We were woodland people, and so it also starts to break down this idea of who we are and how we were. And then the further you go back, you start to see the people as a whole. And so, like, I think that's one of the biggest things that I've taken with my own art from collections.
There's something about the simplicity in some of those older designs that I find so beautiful. And I noticed that again with my grandma's moccasins, just the simplicity of the flower and the fact that we had those floral designs. It leaves an impression on you for sure. So how do you go about making a connection to the items who are our relatives in the collections?
I think one of the things that it's just seeing them and being able to hold them. For me, it was like, I know when I went out to NMAI, that's so far from home. And you think of all these other collections that are so far from home. And for me, it was like when I would go into collections and I would see certain things, and it was just like telling that relative there, I see you and I'm here. And it was like, because they all have their own spirit to them. They all have their own story to them. And so it's like, I feel like one of the most important connections was acknowledging them and that they are there. And even same in Minnesota. And I think we're fortunate to have a collections that close to home. But when you think of all the other collections elsewhere and knowing that those relatives exist out there, and how often a Dakota person can go into collections and see those relatives, or any other person of another tribe can go in and see their relatives and acknowledge that they're there and that, they're still important. I think for me, that's how I've always understood it. I think others may see it differently, but for me, it's like, that's the closest I'm going to get to my relative from 100 years ago. And I have to be that relative back, even though the other relative may not be here, but this is what they've left.
So no, you and I were talking earlier today about that connection, right? And about how it's so difficult as Native people to walk into museums and to see our items here, to feel that loneliness, right? And there's a sadness, I think, that often comes across, and in trying to heal that and trying to get through to a point where we can feel comfortable and make our own way within these spaces is so incredibly important. To have the courage to come and work with these items and reconnect with them and to be that support for these items for our relatives too, I think is so incredibly important. And you had talked about some particular moccasins as well, the redbird moccasins, and we have those here. So what can you tell us about these?
So these ones are one of my favorites. The first time I went over to MHS and I did go into collections, I was just going through, and looking at things, and I pulled out this drawer and I seen these moccasins, and I looked at them and I said, those are mine. And I said, you need to give these back. And, they were pulling up information about them. And they said, well, these moccasins were made by a Dakota woman, and her name was Redbird Woman. And I was just like, just something came over me, and I was just like, these are my moccasins. And it was like, I was just like, wow, like to be drawn to something like that and to also have that back connection, it just made me realize even more that, you are connected. And, and I understand that, like, there are times when people go into collections and you're sad and you're angry because it is overwhelming, but it's also our healing, and it's also part of healing that we need as people within our community to remember who we are and where our relatives are at.
Mhm. Well, and it's so important to think about how we do this together, right? And how those of us who work in museums and artists who are coming into museums figure out a way to work together to do this. So the person handing me these wonderful items is Ben Gessner over here, with the purple hands. And so I just wanted to give him a quick shout out. He's a hand model today. But yeah, Ben is one of the people who created and helped start the Native American Artists in Residence program. And I think that having programs like this are just so incredibly important. And again, making those, reconnecting these pieces to home and reconnecting people to traditions and stories, all of that is so incredibly important. Was there a particular historic piece in another museum that you went to that you found had a real impact on your life and your work?
The piece that when I went out east to NMAI, was 1830s Dakota Cradle Board. When I seen those, it was truly, like, I was truly grateful, because when you look at these cradle boards, there's so much detail, there's so much love that went into creating them. I mean, you look at the materials that were gathered to create it. You look at the different techniques. I mean, from one that I looked at, there were 7 different types of quill work that went into this one cradle board. And then you think of this was what a child started its first stage of life in. This child was loved this much, and they laid this child in this cradle. And, for me, because I started to learn with cradle boards for my own children, it was like I could feel and connect to this mother or this family who lay their child in this cradle. That was so beautiful. Like to me, that means a lot, because I know what it meant to create a cradle for my child, and I could relate to them for creating this beautiful cradle board for their child. And, those cradles, there's very few in existence here. In doing research, there's like 9 different cradles, but that doesn't account for all those cradles that have been taken away from our home. And so, and we're, to see them, to see these cradle boards are, it just shows, that love between a mother and a child. And, I'm really happy to be able to have gone into these collection spaces and see these types of cradles, even see parts of these cradles, because with these quilled cradle boards, there's a story behind them. There's a teaching in the design. There's, it's telling us more than just what is. It's relating our own teachings back to us.
So we do have one book here, Dakota Woman's Work, which is available through Minnesota Historical Society Press, that we wanted to mention, that talks about some of the history of some of these practices and of women coming together and creating with one another. We also have a beautiful image that I'm hoping somebody can pop up on the screen of the womanhood ceremony. And we have this image in the Our Home Gallery, and it shows the ways in which these teachings, you've brought them home to your own community, right?
Yes, this is a picture of the Young Women's Healing Camp, Wikoshkalaka Yuwitapi. And this was from 2 years ago. We didn't have one this year, but this is from 2 years ago, and it's bringing these young women together to help them learn, to help them gain themselves through the life ways, through the teachings, and to help them transition from that first stage of life into the second stage of life as a young Lakota woman. And, we're very fortunate to be able to, do this with the young women. And especially now during this time, it's hard, because it's like you prepare all year to gather with these young women, to be with them, to share with them, to hear their stories and help them make that transition. And then you think of all the relatives that it takes to make this happen. It is a lot of work, but all the relatives pull together. And, in that sense, maybe for those days, they create a community. They create what our home would have looked like a long time ago.
And so these traditions are being passed down to our daughters, right?
Yes.
And that sense of community and of family, of tiwahe, I think that's so incredibly important. And it's so wonderful that you're living home in your community where you can share that with your children and with your family members. So, I think we might have some questions. I'm not sure if we should take questions right now. They should pop up. I know we had some questions throughout the series, and we were asking people to feel free to ask questions. And there we go. Here we see Megan Evans asked, do residents from the program collaborate with one another? And if so, who did you collaborate with? And what did you learn through your experiences?
When I was in the residency, there was another artist in residence as well. And during our time in our residency, we didn't collaborate together really, but we were aware of each other and the areas of our research. Towards the end of our residency, we were able to meet each other and have, really engage each other. I think previous to this residency, I was fortunate enough to be an apprentice to another artist in residence. And in that aspect, that was with Gwen Westerman. And with her, she brought in 3 young Dakota women to work with. And so through that program, it really, through her residency, it really allowed us to work together, to learn together, and to come together and to learn what she was researching at the time was Dakota women work. And through that apprenticeship with her, I was able to gain knowledge of Dakota ribbon work. I was able to learn how to create Dakota ribbon work and the importance and the history behind it. So I think and then during my residency, I had one apprentice that I worked with, and it was the same thing. So it's like, once again, bring it into the community, but also finding somebody to share that knowledge and experience with as well. So in that sense, yes, there is a partnership that you do create.
How would you describe ribbon work for those who aren't familiar?
Dakota ribbon work is like manipulating and the folding of like taffeta ribbon. If Ben could show the moccasins, you can see it's very intricate folds that creates different designs. And when we worked with Twing Gwen with it, she had us work with taffeta. And so she wanted us to work with some of the original types of ribbon that our relatives used. And a lot of it, and one of the things that I really always remember is the hidden hand stitch. We had to learn how to hide our stitch. And when you think of that, how many people today hand stitch anymore? So I always remember that. So whenever I am hand stitching anything, I'm like, my thread better not show, because she would make sure our thread didn't show in our ribbon work. So those small things are really important now as an artist.
And those are those anti-teachings that are so important, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So Hupahu Ziwi is asking, I have been told certain families own certain designs. How can you get permission to use or revitalize a family's design? And she's asking because she says, I have a relative who remakes designs she has seen in museums. She would love to know more about designs and knowledge behind family designs.
I actually think that's a really important teaching there. And I relate it back to when I was a geometry teacher, and just being in collections and working with designs myself. That was one of the most important things that you should understand, is a lot of these designs are tied to families. And I don't think unless you come from that family, you should have a right to recreate that design, because you don't know what it represents. You don't know what story they're telling. And the other part is being able to break down the designs and what each of those designs mean once you put them together. It is telling somebody's story. It's telling an honor. It's telling a feat. It's telling something about the family. It is a really sensitive issue with recreating somebody else's design that's not yours. I think if these designs were seen as family history and understand that the designs are tied to individual families, there would be a greater understanding that we can't just take. And that's part of when you do research, there's certain designs on these cradle boards that I had seen. I don't feel I have the right to create them. I don't feel the right to use this design because I don't quite understand the full story behind it. And so it's just like, having that respect and knowing that you can't just make things, you have to understand it to another level.
Interesting because the histories of these items in museums, with whether it's a collections item, whether they're moccasins or archives or stories or photographs, I think that's something that as Native people and as our allies who work in museums think a lot about is what's appropriate, right? And how can we share somebody else's story when it's theirs, or somebody else's image or likeness, without the family knowing. And I know that's something that we struggled with here in the Our Home exhibit, or we're cognizant of, that we paid attention to. And so I think it's really important that that point is brought up. Jerome Clark asks, what advice would you give to others thinking of undertaking a similar type of work in their community? Where should they start and what should they expect?
I think if you're gonna do it in another community, I think you should. It depends on community, and I say that because I think of my mother's Dene, and down south, there would be a different protocol, a different teaching about going into collections and working in collections, compared to up here. I think one of the most important things to do would to find out if that is okay and to get permission and to ask. I think in anything that we do, we should always ask about it and start there. Anytime I've ever really started to go into anything, I've asked for permission. I've asked for an understanding. And then in the sense of creating spaces like that, you have to be, I guess you have to be ready. And you have to you have to find people who want it. I really say that because working with Erin with Sisseton Wahpeton College, they wanted it and they made it happen. And so if you put in that effort, you put in that time, it can happen. But there's always feel like there's multiple aspects of it. There's a cultural component of, is it okay? Or then there's just creating the space and then having the resources of a collection of a place to be. And so not just focusing on one aspect, but understanding all of them.
Mm-hmm. How are you encouraging your children to continue these traditions that you have been helping to revitalize in your community?
With our children, in our community, I live in my husband's community currently here in Pine Ridge. We do a lot of community work, but a lot of time our children are right along with us. Our children are there learning along with us. And I feel like what I've seen when I look at my oldest daughter now, I see who she's become. She's very sure of herself. She knows these things. She understands everything. And so I don't ever feel like I've ever sat with her and said, you need to do this because of this. Just by her watching and listening and being in the community with us, or being at a family gathering, being where we're at, she's picking that up. When we're working on art, when we're working on things here at home, they're a part of it. They're always with us. They're never left anywhere. They're always just right with us doing it themselves.
So you're modeling these teachings for them, and instead of telling them, you're showing them, right? And it's just a regular part of your everyday life.
Yes.
One of the things you mentioned earlier too that I thought was really beautiful, you shared the ways in which your children have been teaching you.
Yes. My children are my biggest teachers. And I say that because sometimes they see things and they say things that I'm like, how old are you? Because it's like I always feel like that they've come back or that like, they're this old unchi, and then like my 8-year-old she says these things sometimes and I'm like, it gives me the chills because I'm like, how do you know that? But I think as you raise them to who they're supposed to be, that's that gift in return. And so it's like directing me, helping me understand to a whole nother level. And so like there's never a time where they're not teaching me something.
Yeah. And I see you have your beads behind you, right?
Yes.
So is this your workspace?
Yes, this is my beading sewing room. These are all my prized beads. I do have some artwork here. These actually belong to my children. Here's my third daughter's bonnet.
Beautiful.
Louise bonnet. This one has Dakota ribbon work on it.
Oh, wow.
And this one is Pejuta Otowi's bonnet. And this was something that I created when I was working with Twingwen. She had us create projects and we had to make something. And she told us, make whatever you want, but, find a way to do it. And so that was what I ended up creating because I was going to have my fourth daughter.
So many daughters.
Here's another piece that I'm currently finishing, and here it's a knife sheath. This is my oldest daughter's, and this is part of preparing for her womanhood ceremony and what she'll need. And so it's like, I feel like with art, there's a never ending, or like with my girls, there's a never ending need of what they really need and what's important for them.
And I think about our daughters and the ways in which they teach us so much, and they open up this new perspective on life and on the world around us. Have you noticed at any point in time your daughter's teaching you a different perspective of something that you saw in collections, maybe?
I did. One of the things like I always like with one of my girls was like they don't get to go into collections with me, but when I bring back and I start showing them the pictures, they'll be like, wow, look what they created. Look at how they did that. One item in particular was actually a knife sheath, and it was a smaller knife sheath. It was probably like, I would say 5 by 4 inches. And my 8-year-old was looking at it, and her name's Wichakbi, and she said, wow, Mom, look, that must have been the first thing she made. And it had different color beads. It wasn't perfect, but she noted that must have been one of the girls' first creations. And then she said, that's probably what mine will probably first look like, huh? And I'm like, yeah, you're right. But for me, it was like, she wants to make it. She knows she's going to make it. Not so much like, do I have to make this? But there's going to be a time when I'm going to make this. And that's what mine will look like. But later on, it will look like something else.
So she never questioned whether it was something for her to do. It was just a matter of when, right?
Yes.
I think that's awesome.
And the same thing with the Cradle Board we'll be working on next. Like they're excited. They want to pick out the beads. Funny story is when my oldest daughter was a little girl, we went to visit Erin. And Erin opened up this case of beads and my daughter turned it around so fast and she was like, wow. And I mean, she was like 3 years old. And I was like, oh my gosh, my 3-year-old is already obsessed with beads.
All the beautiful colors and just thinking of all the amazing designs they can make.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it really inspires their creativity in ways that little Dakota girls need to be inspired. So I saw we had another question pop up here. Avery Jones from Flandreau asks, in the older Cradle boards, did they have boards in them? I wonder if we made them the same way we made splints for baskets by pounding logs.
In the older cradle boards, they did have a board on the back. They weren't like the soft cradles. They were more closer to the Ojibwe style of cradle boards that you see. It had the flat board in the back, but it also had the bow over the top and then a bow at the bottom, and then with the quilled wraps to keep the baby in. So they are very distinguished and different looking than the regular, like the cradle board that you guys currently have.
And here's another image that I think shows, you'll have to excuse my trolls Band-Aid here. My daughter put that on my finger this morning. As appropriate, can you talk more about the design on your daughter's cradle board?
Which one? Just kidding.
All of them.
Each of my daughter's cradles did come from a design that I created. Like I think of Weechakbee's cradle board when I started that. That was actually a design that I seen not on anything, but like I dreamt of it. And I honestly first wanted to have a tattoo of it. But that would have been huge. And so when I seen it, I drew it out. I'm not the best artist with drawing, but I can beat anything. And so I drew out this design and I actually had it with me for a very long time. And then when I knew that I was going to create her cradle, I knew that I was going to use that design. And that one's actually Monica. That's my first daughter. My second daughter, the design, and when I was creating it, I wasn't showing anybody, but the most important thing about hers was I used two symbols that were the stars and the joining of two homes. And then in the night sky in the cradle, I created this teepee. And, it was very elaborate, but I didn't know what her name was going to be. The night that she was born, my father-in-law gave her name. And so my husband went out there, and so we didn't know what her name was going to be. And so when he came back, he had her name, and it was Weechakbee Tiikjewi, Lodge Made of Stars Woman. And it was like I hadn't shown any pictures of this cradle that I had made to anybody, but this cradle matched her perfectly. And on the geometric work, it had the lodges and it had the stars. But not only that, in the night sky above the black hills, I had created a teepee in the stars. And I was just like, this is her cradle board. This was meant to be hers. And so like things like that, I think that in different ways that their designs based on their cradle has been tied to who they are.
That's beautiful. So what kind of projects are you working on now?
Currently, I am finishing up a project that's going to be for another exhibit with Okta Museum. And that one will be I can't tell you what it is right now because it's a surprise. That project I'm finishing up. And then I'm going to have a new trakoja come April. And so we are starting baby's cradle board, and, we're preparing to make it. And it's exciting because like cradle boards are one of my favorite things, and to have a new trakoja and to put them in the cradle boards even better. So right now we're, looking at, what we're going to put on it. And my trakoja that's coming, her dad is Lakota and the mom's Diné Dakota. So it's like, I think that's always that interesting part is what are you going to put on it? And so thinking about the design, thinking about the family history behind it and how that's going to be represented. So that's after this project, that will be my next project.
So thinking about, this time that we're all living in, I mean, we're doing this virtually, right? And how do you think the pandemic and sort of where we're at today has possibly changed the way that you work?
I actually think that if we were to look at this time now as a lesson for all of us and how we work, I think when we talk about how our families were separated so long ago and we lost that family nucleus, I feel like right now that this time is teaching us that how to be a family, how to interact with one another, and how to work with our children, and how to create and how to be a family, and how our families are supposed to exist. I think if we were to look at the positive of having to be home and to having to be around each other and not, always on the go, 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 it's teaching us so much more. And even with art, that means I get to create, I can sit there and we can have a beating movie night and they're working on something, I'm working on something, but at the same time, we're enjoying each other. And before, we were so busy that those little things like that weren't possible.
So Pidamaya, thank you, Randilynn, for sharing with us today. I don't know if there were any other thoughts or anything else you wanted to share.
I just want to say thank you to everybody and all those who have helped me, who have taught me, who've been there with me, who've created places in those spaces, and just, a big wopi tanka to all of you.
So we want to thank everyone for joining us today. The Artists in the Gallery series highlights many of the artists featured in the new exhibit, Our Home, Native Minnesota. My purple glove friend over here is handing me things so I don't forget. And support of this program is provided by the Rosemary and David Good Family Foundation, and my colleagues and I who have developed this exhibit are all forever grateful to the Native artists such as Randilynn and educators who have contributed to the creation of this exhibit, of this space, which is ours in the Minnesota History Center. The History Center has reopened, and you can reserve your tickets for an opportunity to visit Randilynn's work here in the gallery. A recording of this program will also be available shortly on Facebook and YouTube. Please join us again next month when Denise Lajimadir, who is Turtle Mountain Ojibwe, will talk about her work as a birch bark biter. And that will be happening on November 19th from 3 to 4 p.m. And Denise Lajimadir will be interviewed by curator Benjamin Gessner. Mr. Purple Hands will be doing some interviews. And again, talking about birch bark biting, which is fabulous. She was a former resident. And then in December in the gallery, we will have Gwen Westerman and Erin Griffin, two wonderful relatives that we were talking about today. We'll have them here in the gallery or in the next installment on December 10th from 3 to 4 as well. And so we really look forward to sharing those experiences with you all. Having a hard time figuring out what time it is, so I apologize. Thinking about the Erin Griffin and Gwen Westerman coming to be with us here in the Our Home Gallery. They were both former artists and residents as well. And I think you mentioned that intergenerational transference of knowledge that came from them as well. And their work is displayed here in the gallery, as well as Denise's work is displayed here in the gallery, your work. And I think that one of the things that is so beautiful about this exhibit is that we have these historic items from collections mixed in with contemporary pieces from artists such as you. And I think it's really created a powerful and a wonderful space for all of us. So I personally just want to thank you for contributing to Our Home Native Minnesota. Pidamaya.